Welcome to episode 10 of the Filmmaking Through Music podcast. I'm your host, John Wader, and my mission is to help filmmakers like yourself achieve a more commercially appealing film through the effective use of music and scores. What that means is having original bespoke music created specifically for your film to help with a consistent narrative and emotionally aligned storytelling. This is episode 10 of the podcast, which is a nice little milestone. And today I want to talk just a little bit more about understanding the role that a film composer plays on your storytelling team, because the composer absolutely is part of that storytelling team. They are part director, part editor, part writer, part actor, right? They're taking on a little bit of all of these roles as we create music for your film. Just a couple of things I think to look out for is just, learning why a film composer is so crucial for enhancing audience engagement and emotional connection on that film. That'll quote again, like, no one knows why films need music, but we all know that films need music. Of course, there's exceptions. I want to talk a little bit just about, again, how that storytelling components are kind of amplified on your film through their original music, gain little insights to just that collaborative process, between directors and composers, which is such a big part of this podcast, and just really just kind of like understand that importance and continue to kind of, establish that trust and build that desire for making sure that you are working with, a film composer and not relying on, generic stock music or relying on, music producers as that music, while exceptional, and those career paths in music, while fantastic, they aren't targeted or made specifically for your film. And that's what your film composer is there for. Before I even get into the meat of the podcast, at the time of recording this, I am just getting back from a trip to Nashville where I got to see Hans Zimmer perform live at a big arena with his massive 40, 50 piece band playing all the hits from all his big movies of the last 30, oh my gosh, maybe 40 years. If you go back to, I guess Lion King was 32 years at this point in 2025 or something like that. I'm not sure, but just being able to see him play his scores and parts of his scores live, nothing's more re-motivating or re-inspiring or continues to help you pursue your dreams in this industry more than seeing that. It was quite the concert. But let's dive into kind of more understanding the role a composer plays in storytelling. And I think it starts with collaboration. Collaborating with a composer earlier on, that alone allows you to have a better storytelling relationship with the composer, right? Sharing your vision, sharing your goals, and helping them understand what's the underlying heart of this story, because that really opens up communication lines to establish trust, allow you to value your composer's expertise, and allow you to establish a better rapport when it comes to sharing feedback and those types of things. And so I really recommend just getting involved early with your composer, because you're going to have a better experience with them. The most challenging or the hardest or the worst experiences that composers and directors have with each other are often those last minute, hey, I need music right now, because it just starts with a rush, right? Because you are rushed. And so being able to have casual conversations, not even about your film, 3 months, 4 months before working together, is really underrated in my opinion. There are films that I have agreed to work on that I won't start composing for 6 months or maybe even a year, but I keep in touch with those directors and those producers. We follow each other on social media. We have catch-up calls every now and then, just hearing what's going on. They might still be working on casting, or they might still be refining their script, or they might just be sending me a couple minutes of footage from, one day on set when they were filming in the summer, but they're finishing the movie in the winter or something like that. And again, it's all about establishing trust. I think it really starts with trust being that foundational pillar that you want to establish in order to have that strong storytelling partner. I've said this quote before, whether it's on the podcast or social media, about films are stories told 4 times. First, when you write it; second, when you film it; third, when you edit it; and fourth, when you do sound and music. Each time you go through that process or phase, the story can change, right? You write it, there you go, it's on paper. Well, you filmed it a little bit differently. Okay, great. Oh, that wasn't the story we were going to make, but we really like it. Now we edit it. And it's like, oh, wow, the edit really, emphasizes this dramatic pause or this narrative way of storytelling, or this linear way of storytelling, or something like that. And then, of course, sound and music, we're the emotional glue of that film there. And I think like the approach that I'm talking through is not inherently anything super original or unique, right? Like successful filmmakers follow this approach, and successful filmmakers are known for their collaborative spirit and creative vision and commitment to music. Like, again, going back to, me seeing Hans Zimmer this weekend, right? How many Zimmer Nolan, scores did he play? There's just so many examples of being able to work together. You have definitely, or most likely, heard that story about how Chris Nolan asked Hans Zimmer to write a piece of music to a short story or a fable that Nolan wrote. And he said, just write me a piece of music about this. And Zimmer writes them a piece of music. Nolan goes over his house. They listen to it. And then Nolan says, okay, well, I better go make this film now. And Zimmer said, well, what is the film? And Chris Nolan goes into talking about Interstellar and this massive space epic. And the piece of music that Hans wrote was on the soundtrack. It's called Day One. That was the first demo. It's a very intimate piece. And the story goes from those guys that Nolan said, well, now I know that what the heart of the story is, right? And the heart of that story is ultimately about being a parent and doing something for your child and trying to get back to your child. And so that's probably the best example I have of getting started early and establishing trust early on as well. But it defends that desired identity of having an approach that's focused on the collaboration and a commitment to that original bespoke music with as much attention and effort as you do with your writing and your DP and your acting as well, because it's all components that fit into the larger storytelling of your film. And some of the other benefits I think you'll get out of that is that long-term success and long-term relationships, right? The second film you do with any collaborator, whether it's an editor or a director of photography or a composer, like those longer term relationships lead to better success and better working environments in the future. I think it's a good, level set, right? About benefits and desired identity and kind of the background of this episode. So I think we'll go into just a little bit more of that core process of, what should you be thinking about and what should you be working on? And so we've already hit on the first one, right? And it's getting involved early. Bringing a composer on during pre-production for nothing more than conversations at the minimum, right? It's I guess it's an oxymoron of nothing more than the minimum, but it's about just establishing that relationship and just getting the creative juices flowing, as we so often put it. But it's also at that time that you're going to, have that back and forth discourse about story, inspiration, references to, right? Whether it's a film reference or whether it's a musical reference, that is something to be shared at those earlier stages. Not to mention, of course, the literal vision and goals. And so create a vision of what you're going for here, goals of what you're going for here in terms of the output, what happens, 6 months after you complete the film, those types of things. And then we can get into what I've certainly talked about before is just sound palette and sketching. And so this is really, really only able to knock this out of the park when you are getting involved early. And that's allow your composer to experiment, allow them to play around with sounds and instruments and different themes and different makeups of orchestras and bands and instruments, so that you can start getting an idea of, is this kind of the right idea of what we're going for? If you're waiting to the last minute, again, a lot of this podcast episodes end up going back to getting involved early, I guess, but you're limiting your ability to be creative when you wait to the last minute. And the last minute means, we have a deadline at the end of the month for a festival, right? And it's January 1st or whatever. If you're working on a feature film or even a short film, waiting till, hey, we have a deadline in 4 weeks for composing is always kind of putting yourself into a little bit of a corner. But the ability to experiment and express and be free without the looming deadline is so valuable. Now, I like looming deadlines because that tells me I know what I have to get done when I have to get done. A lot of composers feel that way. But that's when I have, my project plan set up of like, okay, I have this many minutes of music to write. I have this many pieces of music to write. I have this much time. I know what I need to get done. That's very useful, deadline management. But it's I'm just going to spend a couple hours just working on something inspired by my conversation with you, my director, right? Inspired by, this couple pages of script that you wrote that I know the edit's coming in a month or two. But I can just start saying, hey, I wrote this piece of music inspired by your film, and regardless of if the director likes it or regardless of if it goes into the film, the art is created, right? And the art didn't exist in this world without that script or without that conversation. And again, you might use it in the film. You might write something 3 versions later that wouldn't have been written without that first version there. And so again, it goes back to giving yourself that ability and your team the ability to actually have those experiments and do that sketching and go through different score styles. Because again, you've already shared your inspiration, your likes and dislikes. Now the composer is there to share their professional point of view, write something based on their industry experience. And the reason that this is important is because the output of it, right? The output of this is, again, goes back to trust, right? So trust and starting early are, like, again, the two big themes that are just coming up on this episode, allows you to trust that your film score is going to be composed and produced consistently and cohesively throughout, right? That's, if I'm a film director, I need to trust that when I'm hiring my composer, that their film score is going to be, again, narratively and emotionally aligned, kind of my two big things there, but it's going to be consistent and cohesive, right? So you can have a mix of those, right? You can have a consistent film score, but it's not emotionally or narratively aligned, right? You could have a cohesive film score. The film score is cohesive, but if it's not narratively aligned, you're missing out. So it's really those, I guess you would almost call it 4 pillars, right? Narrative, emotion, consistent, and cohesion. Doing all this prep work up front, giving your composer that time for it, is what's going to allow you to have that positive outcome of, again, consistent, cohesive, narratively aligned, emotionally aligned. And it's also, a really important part there. It's also at that point, now maybe you have some picture to work with now, but it's also at that point you start working on themes. And so I love working with directors that really grasp themes and, like, oh, I really want to have a musical cue or a theme when this person comes on screen. And that perks up every composer's ears, because they know that's going to be a little bit different every time that person comes on screen. And we love having, a baseline of what we can work off of, but then do it in a fast way, a slow way, a happy way, a sad way, an anxious way, a lighthearted way, and things like that. And it's really at that point of that, again, sketching and sound palette, that you can actually, like, start getting there a little bit early. But then you're going into the actual composing. So let's assume that we've got started early. We've established trust by doing sketching and sound palette. Now we can actually start scoring the film. Now, I'm not going to go into the technical process of what the next step, which is spotting the film. So spotting the film is deciding where music does and doesn't go, but which is a nice way to set up your entire, like I said, like that project plan. But let's assume that's completed. Now let's actually get into composing. And so here you already know kind of the idea of what you want to do for your score. You've had those conversations, you've done the sound palette, you've done the sketching, you've worked on some themes. Now it's just which scene needs which emotion or which theme. So you can really get organized and set up and knowing that, wow, this scene here is a very high emotional moment. It's a peak of frustration for the character. So we're going to work on that. And then you can see what other scenes are related to that. And I really like using, again, you can do this within, your composer does this within their recording software, or you have it in your cue tracker or your spreadsheet or your project management tools of using tags and themes and colors and timelines to just get a visual representation of your film score. I love seeing that. I love being able to use different, like, fields or drop downs and different colors to be like, oh, wow, look at this. If we look at every piece of music in our film, there's a 12-minute chunk in the middle where we're only writing lighthearted music for the protagonist. And then, that might be an indicator of maybe an edit change that you have to make. Maybe that's too long of a time to be having the same story being told, or same mini story being told, or same emotion. So you kind of use those things well. It goes back to a composer helping out with an edit or with direction, because of the insights that they're giving to you based on their perspective for that film score. So, but now we're composing, right? We're composing. It's 3 things, right? It's scoring, it's revising, and it's conforming. It's a process that goes in a cycle, where you're working on a piece of music, you provide that to the director or the producer, and you might have revisions, right? Revisions is a very big part of scoring. I emphasize that because I love using the example of Carlos Rafael Rivera, Emmy winner for The Queen's Gambit, back in, I think, 2020 or 2021. I think the story is like maybe 20 versions of the theme song or something like that. And again, won the Emmy for it. And again, that's the Netflix level. Certainly, some smaller indie projects might not have the time or the budget to be, going for those 20 revisions, but it's not a bad thing to be going through 1 or 2 rounds at all. Because again, you're learning how to work together, and you're trying to unpack, that emotional and that narrative goal. I said, the third part of that is conforming, right? Conforming just means changing the music to the picture. And so you may have approved a piece of music that I wrote, but a week later, you and your editor decided to take out a couple seconds of a chase scene, and now the music doesn't fit. So the music's approved, but it doesn't fit now. So composers go back to do what's called conforming, which is really just editing our own music to fit the updated picture there. If you're working for Picture Lock, you certainly wouldn't have that challenge, which is always appreciated by your composer. But again, not always able to be done, just given timelines. a lot of projects might end here, right after you get those approvals, because we are working with digital instruments. We are working with virtual instruments in our studios where we are writing and playing everything, whether it's a horn, a trombone, a violin, a guitar, a piano. We're either playing the instruments ourselves, or we're playing them through the computer. And so a lot of projects do end there, and then might have some sort of mixing process, whereas others might go to that live recording process with music preparation and hiring musicians in studios, which we won't dive into here. But I think that really kind of that really sums up a lot of that storytelling of why and what a composer does with storytelling on a film. It's a core part of the filmmaking process, and I certainly encourage both composers and filmmakers alike to really commit to that sentiment of a composer is a core part of the storytelling team. Appreciate you taking the time to listen. Again, Filmmaking Through Music Podcast, episode 10. I do have a free sort of online interactive guide that really goes through the film scoring process, and a lot of overlap with this episode as well. But that is something that has a couple mini videos and lots of blurbs and click-throughs and examples of different film scores as well, which will be linked in the show notes of this episode. And if you are a filmmaker and you're looking for some sort of film score consultation for your film, certainly be a link as well to submit an inquiry, to book a call to see if there's anything I can help you with. So appreciate you listening again. Happy filmmaking.